What would a dragon, arguably the most iconic and widely recognized legendary creature in the world, look like if it had the personality of the Wild West? Today we'll be answering that question. One of my favorite channels, Squidmar, just released this outstanding plastic dragon miniature with Archon Studios, the design and pose of which I think are incredible, rivaling the quality of any dragon miniature that I personally have ever seen. Back when he announced it, I knew I wanted to get my hands on one, and if I could, I would do something fun with it. And a dragon rattlesnake hybrid is what I had in mind. I wanted to convert it in such a way that I'd be able to use it personally as a monster in a Wild Western gameplay setting while preserving my favorite parts about it, namely the majestic pose and those huge, beautiful wings. When everything had been removed and cleaned up, I glued it together using plastic cement and superglue as I needed to. The dragon comes with a beautiful base that's a stone pillar with some smaller rocks protruding from the sides. After the base was done, I moved over to the dragon and began assembling that as well. And in case you hadn't noticed yet, I have a little bit of a blister on the base of my right thumb. If you see more small scrapes and scratches and bruises on my hands over the next few months, it's because I'm doing some DIY housework. Every bump and scratch is getting me closer to my new studio setup. Unsurprisingly, the dragon went together very well, and as you can see, it's huge. And I could obviously go ahead and paint it as is and have a great time with it, but I really wanted to give it that Wild Western flair. I'll be doing some minor conversions on the dragon, but most of the major changes will happen to the base. The first thing that I changed was removing the tail. Like I said before, I really wanted to make this a rattlesnake dragon hybrid, so as beautiful as the original tail was, it needed to go. After removing it, I flipped it around so it pointed upward, and I added some wires to get it into the position that I needed it in. Additionally, I added a bit of wire to the tip of the tail as an armature for the rattle itself. I used green stuff to sculpt all of my conversion parts. I started by patching up the gap in the tail that I had just created, and then I rolled out a tapered sausage for the base shape of the rattle. And considering that the rattle is what will make this dragon a rattlesnake dragon, I probably should have taken more time in sculpting the rattle than I did. But I'm pretty bad at sculpting with green stuff, I've discovered, and I had to resculpt it multiple times because I kept smashing it with my fingers. So I ended up with something that was passable, and I was happy with that. To get the mouth to look a little bit more snake-like, I gave the dragon some venomous fangs, and the last step to make this head look like a rattlesnake head was to remove those horns, which was bittersweet, because they're very nice horns. After the horns had been removed, I patched up the empty areas with more green stuff. I rounded it off and blended it into the rest of the head, and at this point I needed to wait for the green stuff to cure, so it was time to jump over to the base. I played around with a few ideas in my head, but because dragons are known for guarding caches of treasure and all, I decided having an open western-looking gold mine with some golden ore spilling out would be appropriate. After removing some of the surface texture and the rocks from around the base, I glued on a molded resin rock using superglue. Because the resin rock is slightly concave on the back, the superglue didn't work in the slightest, so I went with an option that had more volume and body, which is a two-part epoxy glue. I had to mix up one additional batch of the epoxy, but the method worked exactly how I hoped it would, and the rock went on permanently with no further issues. I followed up the first rock with some additional rocks, including a replacement of one of the original rocks that came on the base. And once I felt that the pillar was sufficiently rocky, I flipped over my hobby mat and it was time to fill in the gaps with something messy. And the perfect messy thing to fill in those gaps and look like rock itself was Sculptamold. I mixed up a small batch by hand and I applied it to most of the remaining red areas. The whole time I was working on the base, I was double checking to make sure that the dragon still fit and that it was not off balanced. There are very specific places where the dragon's feet fit. The goal was to be able to plug it right back into the base like nothing had happened. After the first round of Sculptamold was on, it was time to build up the mine at it using some little cocktail sticks. I removed a bit of volume from the base and began lining up the shoring. While I was working on this project, I listened to the biography of Jim Bridger by Jerry Ensler. I knew about Jim Bridger before, but I had no idea how many significant people he had interacted with and just how significant his own life was in the history of the American West. And while that has very little to do with what you see happening on screen right now, I thought it was quite a fun read. It gave me a lot of good inspiration and ideas for my own world building in the wild imaginary West. After the walls of the mine had been put up, I filled it with the ore. I glued all of that in place using super glue, and then I filled in the gaps with smaller and smaller pebbles, working all the way down to sand, which I glued in place with isopropyl alcohol and watered down white glue. After the mine entrance was done and the pile of rubble had been made, I patched up the area around the mine with more Sculptamold and began adding broken external mine parts that have been smashed by the dragon. I also added a loosely hanging chain connecting a few of those wooden pieces together and a wagon wheel to the left of the entrance. I made one more addition off camera, which was a bucket and a shovel on the ore pile. After that, the construction was done. I organized my workspace. At this point, there were a lot of things that needed to fully cure or dry overnight, so I left that till the next day. When I came back to it, the green stuff was fully cured and ready to be cleaned up a bit further and sanded, scraped, and patched with some Tamiya gray putty. And while I had the putty out, I added it to a few other places on the dragon where there were some very subtle but visible seams. When the putty was dry, it was time to paint, but I wanted to be painting on a cleaner hobby mat than this, so I set the Mini aside, cleaned up my hobby mat with some isopropyl alcohol, and then I got to priming. I gave the base and the dragon both a coat of black acrylic primer from the airbrush. I'm really happy with the transformation of all the different colors and materials getting unified with a coat of paint, and as the rest of the base colors went on, it got better and better. I wanted the rocks to look like something that would be found in the Rockies or in the American Southwest, so I kept everything in a nice warm color range. After the deep purple shadows, I layered on lighter and lighter colors, with the rocks getting a little bit more reddish hue and the wood leaning more yellow. This is how it looked at the end of the airbrushing. It was time for the highlights, which I will be painting on with a brush. And while I wrap up painting the rest of the details on the mine, I'd like to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons. After putting a few colors on the wet palette to work with, I began the painting, starting with the green chain. The chain, some additional aging on the wood, and the metal elements of the mine will be the cool break from an otherwise warm color palette that is the rest of the mine. After painting up the highlights on the wood and the rocks, I switched over to the ore pile, which I was originally going to paint as ore with evidence of gold, but in the end it kind of just looks like a bunch of extra large gold nuggets, which would make sense as to why this dragon came and decided to occupy it. Once the mine was in a place that I was happy with, I switched over to the dragon. I'm going to attempt to paint elements of like a rattlesnake. I decided not to go full-on rattlesnake scale patterning across the whole body because I don't think I could have made that look very good with my current painting abilities. So I established the basic shading with the airbrush, and I will be picking out individual elements that should communicate rattlesnake if I do them well, or if you squint your eyes. Once the base colors of the dragon and the lighting had been established with the airbrush, I switched back to a brush and began painting the mouth. The coloring of this dragon is not taken from one specific rattlesnake, but I definitely wanted the bluish white mouth that is common in multiple rattlesnake species. After the mouth, I painted some light diamond patterning on the back of the head and on the neck and the back, and all the way down the tail to the rattle. I finished off the paint job with some highlights and texturing going up the wings, and then I added a few glazes where I feel like some of the saturation had been lost. And with that, the painting was done and the dragon was ready to be perched in its position. I made sure that it was fixed in place securely, and then the last thing to do was to paint the rim of the base black. And after that, I called it good. That is it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Props to Squidmar for putting out such an awesome miniature. If you're looking for a good dragon to use in one of your miniature armies or in a tabletop RPG, I would definitely recommend this one. Huge shout out, as always, to my patrons who do so much to keep this channel going. You guys are the best. Have an awesome week, everyone. I'll see you next time.